I beseech you, my brothers, remain faithful to the earth, and do not believe those who speak to you of otherworldly hopes. Poison mixers are they, whether they know it or not. Despisers of life are they, decaying and poisoned themselves, of whom the earth is weary. So let them go. When I first came across these words from Friedrich Nietzsche, they struck me like a bolt of lightning. And it wasn't just their high-flown biblical style or their venomous eloquence, though I'm certainly partial to Nietzsche's melodramatic prose. It was that they brought to birth something that had been growing inside my own mind, slowly, quietly, painfully, for many years. And it was the realization that not only the Catholicism that I had been raised with, but the very notion of an afterlife, of a world beyond this one that is our true home, is poisonous. It's a poisonous notion that destroys our ability to actually live this life, the earthly life, the only life that we actually know. Now, this might come as a surprise to some who believe that religion in general and Christianity in particular offer hope and meaning. I mean, what could be more life-affirming than to say that we're all children of this all-loving, all-powerful God who prepares for us a place of everlasting bliss? I mean, isn't this the good news, as Christianity likes to term it? Didn't Christ say, that he was the way, the truth, and the life? And this is a very common opinion, especially among converts. G.K. Chesterton, the famous Christian convert, Catholic convert, and journalist, called Christianity a colossal optimism. And many people who are seeing the apparent moral wreckage of post-religious modernity often agree. They often think, well, maybe we really have to go back. But as the son of agnostic parents who did go back, who converted to Catholicism and brought me up on that whole traditional ethos, the idealism, the ritual splendor, the moral discipline, I have a very different opinion. I embraced Catholicism devoutly, as I was raised to. I read Aquinas, the medieval scholastics, pored over the Psalms, the writings of the saints. And yet I found at the end of it all that it not only gave me no life, but that it brought me, by my late 20s, to the edge of despair. And by losing my own life, I didn't find a new one in Christ. I found only emptiness, decay, and truly a spiritual death. Now, before I tell this story, I should add two caveats. The first is that there is many practices of Christianity as there are Christians. So some practices are healthier, much healthier than others. And some of the healthiest people I know call themselves Christians or followers of Christ or something of that nature. But their practice of religion, in my view, has been heavily influenced by more rational, more humanistic, more this-worldly attitudes, which come from the late Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment. And so I think of this Christianity as a much more moderate and balanced form that's at times quite at odds with the Christianity of Paul and certainly Augustine and certainly the historic Catholic Church. The second caveat is that in this video, I'm doing an exploration of philosophy through the lens of personal narrative. So this is not going to be an exhaustive analysis of Christianity or an argument against it or its philosophical foundations. It simply asks the question and answers it through personal narrative. Why was a certain kind of religious despair so common among the people that I knew, who took traditional Catholicism the most seriously, who lived it the most faithfully? Why did that cause such intractable and profound psychological pain? And in order to answer that question, I think we have to understand first what Catholicism, especially traditional Catholicism, is, what it teaches about reality and about human nature and human destiny. So let's talk about the basic premise of Christianity first, which teaches that man is made for a life of union with God. So the Orthodox call this theosis, Catholics call it divinization. And God in Christianity is the ultimate value. So everything that is good for man, everything that we desire, is ultimately found in God. And every created thing is good only by participation in the divine nature. So God is not a being among beings. He's being itself, the uncaused cause. And all other beings derive their limited being from his perfect being, his perfect infinite being. And we can use an analogy here. So God is like the sun, and things in the created world are like distant or pale rays of light that are far from the source. And unlike sunbeams, God's creations they're still distinct from him, and they're still contingent, so they don't have to exist. But God's self-existent being is prior to and infinitely greater than a creature's derivative being. And if all of that sounds a bit like Platonism, that's because it is. Christianity was heavily influenced by Neoplatonism, which was very popular in the Roman Empire, the late Roman Empire. Now, because God is being itself, the source of all goodness, we desire him. But because of original sin, we're alienated. We lack a direct connection, a direct experience of God. And our wills are, quote unquote, disordered, is how it's described in Christian theology. Our desire for God remains, but it's misdirected toward created things. So we look at the pale rays of light, and we sort of imagine that they exist on their own, and we can have them apart from the sun, from which they derive their existence. But of course, God didn't leave us like this. He sent us Christ. He sent us a Redeemer. And Christ atoned for our sins in some metaphysical way and made it possible for us to reunite with God. And so the journey of our lives is about accepting the teachings of Christ, cooperating with grace, denying our inclination to sin. And if we do this faithfully, we'll be rewarded in the next life with perfect bliss. So we might summarize this worldview and some of its implications like this. While the world does possess real value as created by God, its ultimate value, like its being, is derived only from God, and apart from him, it has no value. The world has no value apart from God. 2, happiness can't be achieved in the fallen world. 3, the purpose of our lives is to be redeemed from the world. 4, our natural desires for the things of this world are disordered, and we have to discipline them back into harmony with God's divine order. And given the darkness of our intellects and the disorder of our wills, the pleasures and the joys and the things that we love in this world are potentially temptations that draw us away from our true happiness, which is in God. And we can see this throughout Christian theology, but I'm going to quote a few passages here. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof. But he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. This is John 2:15-17. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Which is 2 Corinthians 4:18. And my favorite, all is vanity, to love the world, to covet the flesh, to desire this life. And that's from Thomas à Kempis in The Imitation of Christ. So what precisely do such moral principles look like in practice? Your first guess might be asceticism. If all the goodness of the world is just a faint shadow of the glory of God, it's natural to ask, why indulge in any worldly pursuits at all? Why not live the life of an ascetic and rise through prayer and sacrifice to a direct experience of God? And it's a valid question, and many of the early Christians asked and answered it by becoming ascetics. The Desert Fathers and the Benedictines are early examples of this. But the ascetic path is difficult, even for fervent believers. And if everyone followed it, society would obviously collapse. The human race would die out in a generation. So the church teaches that only a select few are called to this higher path. The rest of the faithful they're called to live in the world, but not of the world, which means that they pursue normal, worldly pursuits, romantic love, child rearing, career, wealth. But they do it with an attitude of spiritual detachment. And they don't do these things as ends in themselves, but as means of giving glory to God and drawing closer to Him. And as a fervent believer, I took this whole ethos to heart. For much of my 20s, I attended Mass not just weekly, but sometimes daily. I followed all of the church's strictures. I abstained from sin not only in action, but even in thought. I would even carefully police my own mind for inclinations to sin, for uncharitable thoughts about other people, for sexual thoughts, for any kind of undue attachment, even to good things, like even good food or success in business or career. And I would always ask myself, is my mind and my heart fixed firmly on God? Am I letting anything, even something inoffensive in itself, come between me and my ideal? And you would think, if the Catholic story were true, that I would find some measure of spiritual peace in all of this. Obviously, I wouldn't be perfectly happy because happiness can't be found on earth. But I would at least possess this conviction and this self-assurance of someone living in the truth. But I found that it was not the case. The practice of Catholicism actually seemed to make me less happy, more anxious, more confused, even resentful. And the more I sacrificed, the more I disciplined my mind and my desires, the more I prayed, the worse all of this got. And the spiritual discipline, it didn't seem to produce any appreciable effect on my, quote unquote, bad habits, or in fact, in many cases, it really seemed to intensify all of the things I was trying to overcome. And this made me suspect that perhaps what I was doing was contrary to my nature. I mean, if it's not working, if it's making things worse, perhaps what I'm doing is incorrect. Perhaps I'm spiritually mutilating myself, not perfecting. And for some time I thought maybe this was just a phase. Many of the saints talk about the dark night of the soul, periods of spiritual desolation, struggles with doubt, with soul-racking doubt. And I thought, well, perhaps, perhaps this is what I'm going through, or perhaps there's an error in the way I'm approaching Christianity. Maybe I'm mistaking my own neurosis for the spiritual life. But I lived in an intentional community that was explicitly founded by devout traditional Catholics. And so I wasn't alone. I had a local priest who was my dedicated spiritual director. I had friends who were priests, nuns, ex-religious, ex-monks, ex-nuns, as well as married and single young people whose lives were devoted to the same ideals as I was. And so I looked to these people for advice and for friendship. And with some of them, I would spend long hours discussing philosophy, theology, the spiritual life. And in the course of all of this, I discovered something that shook my faith even further. And it was that many of these people were even more tortured and stunted than I was. They also suffered in the same way from their spiritual practice, and they'd been suffering in some cases for decades. And one of the beautiful things about suffering is that in strong souls, it can produce a flowering of the personality. It forces you to plumb hidden depths and to uncover new insights and to develop new capacities. But the sacrifice and the discipline that all of these people had willingly embraced, it seemed to have had little, and in many cases even the opposite effect. They often seemed confused, frightened, lost, angry. Few of them seemed to have any higher insight into reality, and some of them gave me advice which I can only charitably describe as counterproductive. And most of these people were good people. They were talented, they were admirable, but their religious practice seemed to have stifled their personalities, not nurtured them. And what I saw in so many, particularly in the religious, the clerical, was the pain of a life unlived. We were sacrificing our values. We were suppressing our feelings. We were really denying who we really were, our own being. And I'd always felt that there was something wrong with the concept of self-sacrifice, with the guilt I was made to feel for desire, for wealth, for success. But I'd always thought, well, maybe the self-abnegation in time will produce a higher self-actualization. God, after all, is the source of all being. And the world, apart from God, is the source of death. So how could forsaking the world and embracing the spirit not produce a blossoming of the soul? But it was very clear that that wasn't what happened. Self-sacrifice did not produce self-becoming, only a deeper and more terrible self-destruction. And not only in my life, but in the lives of spiritual adepts who were far more advanced in the quote-unquote way of perfection than I was. And all of this added up to the question, what if it's all nonsense? What if this world isn't just a feeble imitation of another, more perfect one? What if the earthly values that I eschewed were the only values? And by negating them, I was not ascending to a higher realm, but plunging into an abyss. This was a highly counterintuitive idea to me at the time, that the material world could be a source of value, that the visible reality in front of my eyes was the meaning, was the value, was the justification. Meaning, I had always thought, was a product of consciousness. And so if the world is not a product of consciousness, then it can't have any meaning. And if there is no meaning, then how do you live? How do you make choices? Why choose one thing over another? Why even choose existence over non-existence? How could an impermanent, changing, painful world be any kind of its own justification? C.S. Lewis expresses this very Christian viewpoint very well in an essay he wrote in 1948. He says, and let us begin by supposing that nature is all that exists. Let us suppose that nothing ever has existed or ever will exist except this meaningless play of atoms in space and time. That by a series of hundredth changes, it has, regrettably, produced things like ourselves, conscious beings who know that their own consciousness is an accidental result of the whole meaningless process, and is therefore itself meaningless, though to us, alas, it feels significant. This is why Nietzsche called Christianity not a colossal optimism, but a kind of nihilism. Not only because its morality of self-sacrifice and supernaturalism is inimical to life, as he saw it, but because in the wake of Christianity's demise at the hands of science and reason, the moral ideas and assumptions left over from 2,000 years of Christianity, that meaning and value can only come from a divine creator, that morality without God is arbitrary, these things logically produce modern nihilism. As Dostoevsky famously said, if there is no God, then everything is permitted. But we should ask an important question. What is the psychological origin of this Christian philosophical approach? What type of person flees from this reality and creates another? And Nietzsche's answer is very blunt. He who suffers from it, he who suffers from reality, flees into a fantasy world. It's well known that Nietzsche saw in Christianity a slave revolt, an uprising of the weak and the unsuccessful against the strong and powerful. And Nietzsche saw life itself as the expression of the will to power. And precisely what this means is a matter of debate. But we can think of it as a drive to expand, to assert, to reshape the world and oneself. And when this drive is thwarted, psychological pain, even despair, results. And Nietzsche saw Christianity as the invention of those whose will to power had been broken in the world of action. And Christianity was an attempt to reassert their will to power by an inversion, by devaluing the material world and all its virtues, strength, pride, assertiveness, cunning, and valuing the spiritual world and a new set of virtues: humility, poverty, chastity, obedience, sacrifice. By doing this, the Christian placed himself on top of the moral hierarchy, and he saved himself from the psychological consequences of failure in the real world. So, put simply, in Nietzsche's eyes, Christian morality was an attempt by the weak and neurotic to compensate for failures, to make strength of weakness, victory of defeat, virtue of vice. Now, we can debate this analysis historically, theologically, psychologically, but again, this is a personal story. And the question that I'll ask instead is, did this sort of thing motivate my own practice of Christianity? And the answer is absolutely. Yes, it did. At the age of 18, to give you the backstory on this, at the age of 18, I left Catholicism. I fell into a confused and troubled philosophical skepticism. I wasn't sure if knowledge was even possible, or at least if it were rationally possible. And where that would have taken me morally and intellectually, I'll never know. Because this period was cut short by a totally unexpected event, a disabling illness that actually kept me bedridden or housebound until I was about 23. And this event threw me into moral crisis. Because here I was in constant, excruciating pain, and my life seemed forever changed, and perhaps maybe over before it even started. And so I had to ask myself, was this sort of life worth living? I mean, what sort of life could possibly be had in this state? And I really felt completely helpless, totally defeated, just utterly worthless. And so, in an attempt to get a grip on myself and my life, I turned back to what I knew, Catholicism. And on the bookshelves at my parents' house, I spotted a book that I'd read in childhood, but which had not appealed to me, when I was a young and healthy adolescent. And it was a collection of the writings of Saint Therese of Lisieux, who was a Carmelite mystic who had died of tuberculosis at the age of 23 in the early 20th century, late 19th. And her whole life had been marred by sickness and suffering. Her whole life. And in her spirituality, I found not only comfort, but a meaning for my illness. In her narrative, my illness was not a cause for despair. It was actually a sign of God's affection. It wasn't meaningless. It was something to be cherished, something that actually earned me spiritual merit in the same way that a successful career might earn me wealth or status in the earthly realm. And all of those people out in the world, the people I saw on Facebook and Instagram, traveling, starting careers, graduating college, getting married, they had nothing compared to, my treasures laid up in heaven. So I was precisely the man that Nietzsche described. I was he who suffered from reality and so created for himself another. And this kind of conversion story is actually quite common among famous Catholic mystics and saints. An illness or a failure that forces a coming to Christ. And being philosophically inclined, and especially in a rationalistic way, I couldn't admit that mere emotional necessity was the sole basis for my return to Catholicism. So I also returned to Thomas Aquinas, the scholastic philosophers, the whole tradition of Catholic philosophy, and not too deeply, but just enough to convince myself that I was returning on the basis of reason rather than a psychological compensation. And I spent the next 4 years really deepening my practice and my understanding of Catholicism so that by the time I had mostly recovered, I was fully committed. I was fully committed to living out my Catholicism in the small, community of believers that I lived in. But as you know, while my spiritual illusions had some utility during that, difficult period, they couldn't survive in the long run. They couldn't survive contact with reality and human nature. And as I've detailed, they eventually unraveled. And in the middle of this unraveling, I found Thus Spake Zarathustra, and I found Nietzsche, and I found the line with which I opened this video. I beseech you, my brothers, remain faithful to the earth, and do not believe those who speak to you of otherworldly hopes. Poison mixers are they, whether they know it or not. Despisers of life are they, decaying and poisoned themselves, of whom the earth is weary. So let them go. And I remember when I first read this, I was sitting in my office and I looked out the window at the wide prairie landscape. The blue cloudless sky, the fields that stretched from horizon to horizon. And I looked around and I thought, how do I embrace all of this? Now that I no longer want to escape the world, how do I live in it? And it took some time to find an answer, that was satisfactory. And it wasn't a Nietzschean answer. I'm not a Nietzschean philosophically. But the answer did demand a fundamental reevaluation, a fundamental change in my metaphysics and my epistemology, a deconstruction of all of the concepts by which I had made sense of and interpreted the world. And all of that's beyond the scope of this video, something that I'll talk about more. And I've talked about a little bit in some other videos. But the bottom line was that I believe there is an answer, and with it a kind of salvation, not in some imagined heaven, but here on earth, not in another world, but in this world, the material world, the only world that exists.